three main questions around three core issues that are important to young people, and we'll be starting with Sana.
So the first question is as follows. The youth representation at this ACC, which is about 14% when you include the three delegates who are here as laypersons, has significantly increased in comparison to previous ACCs. Are you satisfied with this number? Or do you think that there is more that can be done to increase youth representation, not just for the ACC, but across all provincial and diocesan structures, such as synod and provincial standing committees?
I think as a church we are, thanks Pastor Sana. As a church we are work in progress, and we may not get all these things right at the same time, but I think I speak for our province, that is our intention, to increase representation of not only the youth, but of the women, the Portuguese-speaking people, the English-speaking people, and different races, and lay or ordained. So representation for us is more than numbers, but it's also about the quality of those that come and help the church to grow in its mission and ministry.
Short answer, no, not satisfied yet. And I think that's because at confirmation in our province, we always say to the young people who are confirmed that now you are an adult in the church, you are a full member of the church. And so to see an increased representation at all levels of the church, I think is really, really important. I have the privilege also of speaking into secular institutions where the young people there have huge questions about the world, massive questions about the world and the future, particularly around political parties and around environment and those kinds of issues. And within the church, that same passion to come into our conversations. So I don't know how that can be done at every level, but are we there yet? We're absolutely not. It's amazing to see the youth delegates this time participating fully in the life of the ACC in terms of in table groups and bringing resolutions, in serving on committees, and also being able to be part of the networks. But in terms of us really hearing that voice and that passion, I don't think we're there yet, and I think we need more.
Thank you. I think I'd want to answer the question in a completely different way. I think one of the biggest dangers for the church in England, and I suspect in many other provinces, is we think youth involvement in the church means people sitting on committees. But actually, real youth involvement is what we've just seen and had the presentation about, which is people going out and changing the world. And I notice in the UK that if I say, who wants to go on diocesan synod, it's amazing how many people suddenly find their shoes are very, very interesting. But if I say in a youth gathering, what are we going to do to change the world on climate change and injustice, then there's energy in the room. So I would say no, it's not satisfactory yet, but simply putting people on more committees is not necessarily a good answer to the problem. The liberation of people of all ages in ministry and witness and transformation and activism in the right sense, that is being active in the service of Christ, and of deepening religious life, is what empowers young people. And I'm always nervous, and we do in the UK, we are failing on youth, on disability, and on UK minority ethnic people. And I'm wary of ending up with a sort of series of quotas, which means that we have identity politics. I want to say, let's go out and change the world, and when we find that we're going out as a bunch of middle-aged white men, then we need to ask ourselves some serious questions about why we're neglecting the vast majority of the church.
Kia ora, thank you again for the responses. This question is about climate change. Recently in a study, a group of 100 corporations in the world were identified as being responsible for 71% of CO2 emissions since 1988. Though our individual efforts to reduce dependence on fossil fuel industry are important, we need to understand, I think, at this stage, from a youth perspective, we feel as though we've been convinced that our individual change is the answer. Meanwhile, corporations continue, without checks and balances, to extract wealth at the expense of God's creation. This act on behalf of corporations displaces disproportionately those who are most vulnerable. Where are we active as a communion, as a group of member churches, in changing the state of affairs? Where are we falling short, and how should we respond?
Okay, I'll hang on to your mic. I've just come back from Mozambique, where the humanitarian crisis due to excessive flooding after Cyclone Idai and Kenneth have devastated the poorest of the poor. Partly is due to the rising sea level, where the places that have been devastated are just slightly below sea level in Beira. But also partly due to what you rightly pointed out, big companies from the global north and south taking trees from Mozambique, creating deforestation, and the people of Mozambique being the poorest in our province, our poorest country, not having created those unfortunate climatic conditions, and they are suffering alone. Rather than complain, we have green Anglicans who are highlighting the plight of those big companies. Climate change is a reality, and the injustice of who suffers because of climate change and because of geographical location is an issue of justice. And I think as the church, we can do more, we can mitigate, we could have seasons of creation, we could change our attitude towards dumping whilst others are suffering. We could look at the impact that plastic has on our sea, and we could make climate change. I don't want to enter the politics of another country, but we could make climate change an emergency. Thank you.
isolated acceptance of what's going on. And I'll explain what I mean. There are parts of the country that understand very well and are seeing the effects of climate change right where they are. And so that will be particularly in the Arctic, massive changes. And there's a growing awareness that even in spots where people feel isolated from it, and it hasn't hit them as the emergency, the crisis that it is yet, there's a growing understanding that while there are things that we're doing in other parts of the world that are affecting incredibly vulnerable people, particularly when it comes to areas around perhaps Canadian mining companies in Africa. There's some terrible practices going on there that are causing incredible climate damage and displacing very vulnerable people. And so I think part of our actions as a church is an awareness of that. Our own consumption, I'll say for myself, I come from quite a greedy culture. We have more of so many things. And the trouble is, when you have more of a lot of things, you can start to believe it's your right to have more, as opposed to seeing how we're connected. And I think the church has a massive role in that, in terms of our connection with each other, and that image of Paul, that when one member of the body suffers, we are all suffering. And so how we need to be giving that message far more clearly. And the idea that, of course, the results, the resources that have come from the Green Anglican movement, the eco-bishops meetings that have been happening, to be more greatly shared in our provinces, in our dioceses, in our parishes. Because I think, yes, there are individual things that we just should and must be doing, but there's also a witness we must be having to the world as groups of people and as larger groups of people. And so in Canada, we added the fifth mark of mission into our baptismal covenant. So when you ask questions, creation is right in there. But we now have to, instead of just having some words out there which sound great and we're behind it, okay, but in our daily lives, what are you actually going to do about it? So I think it's both an education piece, an individual and a corporate commitment to change.
Thank you very much. I think there are a number of factors in here. Starting with Archbishop Thabo, he is, with much humility, which is typical of him, understated his enormous contribution, which comes in two areas. He chairs and leads for the Anglican Communion on climate change, and had a big effect through his organisation of links and interactions at COP21 in Paris, which put a lot of weight behind the Paris Agreement. Secondly, he leads interaction for the Anglicans, which works alongside with Rome, who have played a very key part. We mustn't forget the huge amount Pope Francis has done, not least through his remarkable encyclical, which really shifted the balance in Paris. But Archbishop Thabo, in a worldwide interaction with the extractive industry, and particularly with the mining companies, which is having a profound impact on those companies, and has enabled us to be very blunt with them indeed, and for them to listen, so not just a shouting match. And I think Bishop Jane used the phrase vulnerable people. I think that was a particularly well-chosen moment to raise that. If you look around, you've got Mozambique, yes, you've got the Arctic and the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. In Nigeria, which sadly is not represented here, they would have stood up and said, look at the Niger Delta, and particularly the Ogoni people in the Niger Delta, where I've done a lot of work, where their creeks are polluted, the atmosphere is devastated by sulfur from the flaring of natural gas, and we've been waiting 30 years for cleanup to start. And there, unlike the Arctic, but possibly like other places, you see that the problem is a mixture of climate devastating action and deep corruption in government, which means that when money is made available, it very often does not end up doing what it's made available to do. And I think if we're going to talk about climate change, we need to pick up a phrase about that Archbishop Thabo has used about extracting wealth. Wealth is extracted from natural resources in 2 or 3 main ways. It is extracted by the mining industry legally. It is extracted by the mining industry using aggressive tax management policies which may be legal but are not moral. And it is extracted by certain sectors of governments and leaders in areas where mining takes place improperly and illegally through corruption. Not everywhere, not always, not every company, but in many. If you look at the DRC, the artisan mining in the eastern DRC leaves it as one of the poorest spots on earth, sitting on the greatest resources on earth. The same could be said of southern Nigeria. So I think there is a huge agenda which we are brilliantly placed to tackle under the inspirational leadership of Archbishop Thabo and many others around the communion. And young people are particularly engaged in this, and it is the new generation of political leaders from the current young people who we need to encourage, support, train and develop, so that because they will make the difference that the older generation have failed to do.
Thank you. This is the last question. What measures do you think the Anglican Communion can take to assist provinces under economic strain to help struggling youth gain access to education, especially higher education?
Thank you, Mr. Sana. In the previous response, I also wanted to acknowledge Terry for all the support work that you did for the Anglican Communion Environment Network and for your team. I think we should give the Archbishop made me look smart, but you do all the work. Let's give Terry a round of applause. It's a difficult one, I really don't have an answer for that particular one, but let me just share one practical step that we've done, recently done in our province. We've got mainly male archdeacons, on the whole, male bishops, and we're realizing that the dioceses are sending males again to theological college for formation. And we said, even if we passed a resolution to say we need transformation, it was not going to happen instantly. So we needed to do something in terms of who we sent to college. And then this year we approached a particular business person to create the Archbishop's College of Transfiguration Foundation Scholarship. And we asked him to commit for 3 years to sponsor 5 female students. So we selected 5 female students from the rural parts of our province. And I'm happy to say we've done, it's just a small drop in the ocean of the province, not huge. But I think rather than wait, I always say to the youth back in our province, rather than wait for head office to do something in your locality. Get a few farmers to sell 1 cow, or 1 sheep, or 1 pig. Create a sponsorship from the resources that you have, and translate those into fiscal strength and send people to college. Very often we tend to say, can somebody bring the money? But the assets, Rachel spoke about asset-based. The assets are the cabbage that we plant, the sugar cane, the chambo, and the maize. Maybe pay even our theological college and grab some through those and they can sell them, and then we could make young people to have access to much needed education, particularly in our continent.
3 examples here, and I'll keep them very short, because I think this isn't just about vocation, for training, for ministry, it's life, it's Christian life and vocation, and to have employment, right? I think the first thing is, wherever you're placed, to challenge injustice when it comes to availability for education, the cost of education, so to encourage people to do that with how they vote, how they spend their money, how they talk about that. The example I'll give from that is where I'm from. There's been a real move to try and increase the minimum wage to be a livable wage. And some politicians came through looking to get elected, saying, oh, of course, but we don't need to do that for young people because this is just a job to kind of give them some pocket money, and really misunderstanding that no, actually this minimum wage that we're asking for, it's not enough to live on, it's not a livable income, but it's a minimum wage which they will use maybe to help support their families, to go to school, to do all those things that everybody else wants to do. So for the church to speak into that and say, just a minute, no, that's not how it should be. The second thing is some of our partnerships, and I think particularly the partnership that we have between the Diocese of Edmonton and the Diocese of Buye in Burundi, where they had the physical building for a college. They had local people who, when they would send the students, would send maize and corn, but they needed 2 things. They needed some money to just keep the infrastructure of the college going, and some of the salaries for the people who taught there, and they needed a cow, I believe, for milk. And so we were able to do that and encourage people to support the infrastructure so that then people could go support it from their own communities. So that you're trying to encourage it, but you're lifting up and empowering the community that's there. And the third thing, if you can find someone in the room from Chile, and I know that Sammy is up there, when I was privileged to go on the standing committee visit to Chile, when I saw how they were training up young leaders and supporting them, particularly I was seeing that in Santiago, but there are amazing stories of how that was done and how a focus by the church on people between about 18 and 25 has been incredible in leading to a real lifting of heart and a real belief in the gifts that young people have to offer, and then needing to make it happen. So there are some wonderful examples of it, but we also do have to grab for ourselves that we must speak into those places where we see that equal treatment is not being done, and in our own contexts. So my examples from that.
Thank you. I think, as previously, those are really helpful. I want to mention a couple of different areas, or one linked to a couple of different areas, while fully agreeing with what's been said. It seems to me that in addition to access to higher education, what happens when you finish higher education? There are many parts of the world, and I'm thinking of Nigeria again, but I think I'm looking at Bishop Joel. I think Kenya has the same problem, that a high proportion of graduates cannot get jobs which represent the kind of work they've done. I can see other heads nodding. So there is, in terms of the 5 marks of mission and challenging injustice, unjust structures that keep people out of areas of employment that they should have access to. And this is around issues of economic development and just ways of economic development, the capacity to start your own business, the capacity to develop your own livelihood, which is key to development. Far more jobs are created in every global economy by people in companies of less than 20 people than by the big companies and governments. And yet, certainly in Nigeria, which I probably know as well as anywhere outside the UK, everybody wants to go and work for the government, which consumes resources, doesn't create them for the nation. So that's one thing, that's an unjust structure. How do we give people the skills to create their own development and economy? The second one that we haven't mentioned is agriculture. You know, agriculture is a phenomenally high potential area for trained people. We don't have to talk only about white-collar jobs in big cities. You look at some of the developments in agriculture in the highlands in Kenya, in the Rift, and they have created vast numbers of jobs and some really highly skilled work and bring a lot of income into the country. And those are areas that really are significant. The third thing is girls' education. Where money's short, girls don't get educated. That remains something we need to challenge very profoundly. And I have to say, one of the ways you do that is have more women in ordained ministry and in the episcopacy who are models of higher education through the work and the way they work.
Can I just add one more thing? And if anyone's feeling, the thing of don't look at me because I'm young, we were reminded last night by Bishop Stephen, and I was reminded again this morning of Mary. Just remember that Mary, her yes, she was pretty young when she said that, and a lot of stuff couldn't have happened if she hadn't said yes. And Jesus' ministry was all over by the time he was about 32. So just that whole idea of kind of what young people have to offer. Sorry, that doesn't fit with anything other than it was on my heart to say it. So.
Before we step down, I think we'd just like to say thank you. You've provided us with a different perspective and something to take home to each of our various provinces as we leave. And we will try and keep trying and push for participation from our people. But thank you so much for providing us with a platform when it wasn't even on the program, and thank you for giving us recognition. So we really appreciate it.